Just almost to the end of our topic, I want us to look at some of the differences between the four limbs of these two animals. We have a bat and as well a mole. A similarity they have is this. All these two animals are mammals. To be specific, they have mammary glands that they can actually be able to confirm to us that they are able to feed their young ones on milk through a process called breastfeeding. And you see, if you look at their forelimbs, for example, you'll realize that the forelimbs of a mole and that of a bat are slightly different, and that's why they are adapted to perform their functions differently. For example, these animals' forelimbs have elongated phalanges and with long claws. Elongated phalanges with long claws. But the mole's forelimbs have short, stout phalanges. Elongated and long phalanges. Elongated and long phalanges. Short and stout phalanges. That brings out the difference between the phalanges of these two animals. So one has elongated phalanges, but the other one has short, stout phalanges. So the bat's forelimbs have elongated phalanges with the long claws, while that of a mole have short, stout phalanges. Now, the bat's forelimbs will be able to spread out skin so that this can form a wing for flight. But those of a mole, because they are short and stout, they are able to dig out or to dig up food from soil. So dig up food from soil. Dig up food from soil. So I can look at a mole and have short stout phalanges which are able to dig up food from the soil. I can look at the bat's forelimbs and realize they have elongated phalanges with long claws so that they can well spread out to form a wing. So I saw it better for us to just look at some of those differences so that you can be able to move to something else. And I'd want us now to embark on something different. I want us to look at the mechanism of evolution. The mechanism of evolution. Mechanism of evolution. So with the mechanism of evolution, we are going to use two theories to actually have a better understanding of how evolution must have occurred, or to show how evolution actually occurs in real life situations. For example, in our syllabus, and more information to actually help us understand this area very well, we've been given Jean Baptiste de Lamarck's theory. Jean de Baptiste Lamarck's theory. And this theory came into work in 1809. We have this other scientist and this other archaeologist and a philanthropist that loved his country so much called Charles Darwin, that also came up with a theory that has well much helped us in as far as evolution is concerned. So we have two theories to actually help us understand how evolution occurs. or to actually help us reinforce this aspect of how organisms evolve. So if we begin with Lamarck's theory, we'll realize that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed several hypotheses regarding the mechanism of evolution. One of the hypotheses he actually came up with was when the environment demands the need or use of a particular structure in an organism, the organism now develops the structure in response to the environmental demand. For example, if a giraffe has to have its neck well getting demanded in the environment, the giraffe will develop that structure, the neck, in response to the demand that the environment has towards that organism. If an environment demands that the organism uses its forelimbs for fast running, then that organism or those organisms will develop their forelimbs so that they can be able to fulfill what the environment demands. So because the organisms end up developing the structure in response to the environmental demand, then this will lead to the natural use. Okay, the organism will naturally use that structure because the environment demands the need for that structure. So there will be either natural use or disuse of the structures. And because the organism naturally uses or disuses the structure, it will lead to changes in the individual during its lifetime. Let me begin from here. I am an organism, for example. I am in a particular environment. Then that environment demands that a particular structure on my body gets needed. I'll develop that structure in relation to the demand of the environment. And in that process, I'll literally either use that structure or disuse that structure. And in the process of using the structure or disusing the structure, certain changes will get produced in me as an individual during my lifetime as I'll be living on this earth. Now, Lamarck proposes that the structures or these changes to the structures that the organism acquires during its lifetime will be transmitted to its offspring and subsequent generations. And in the process, there will be a rising of or emergence of new forms or new species. I began from here. We are in a particular environment as organisms. That environment demands that we develop certain structures in our bodies. Our bodies will respond by developing those structures in relation to the demand of the environment. In the process, the organisms will either use or disuse their structures to fulfill the demands of the environment. And in the process of using or disusing, the structures will actually undergo changes in the organisms during their lifetime. Lamarck goes on and says that these changes are going to actually get transferred or transmitted to the offspring of these organisms and further to the subsequent generations of these organisms. And in the process, because the changes have been transmitted to these offsprings or the subsequent generations, then at the end of the day, those offsprings with these new changes from their parents will actually become new forms or new species. Look at that. Then, of course, if I'm a parent and the environment demanded that I develop a strong hand, what happens? I will either use this hand or disuse this hand to develop that change that the environment demands from me. And this acquired change or this produced change in this individual, in this individual's lifetime, will actually be able to get transmitted to the offspring during its lifetime and its subsequent generations. In the process, these are going to be new forms or new species compared to the parent. These forms that emerge with the new changes acquired from the parents will have certain advantages over their ancestral forms in the exploitation of this ecological environment. Because I developed a structure, I underwent some changes, I produced some changes in my structures because of using or disusing the structures I have transmitted those changes to the offspring and subsequent generations. Then at the end of the day, I'm going to actually understand that these new forms or these new species having these new characteristics or features will be able to have certain advantages over their ancestral or parental forms in exploiting this environment. Now, he cites an example of the present day long-necked giraffe from the short-necked ancestral forms. He says that the short-necked giraffes constantly stretch their necks to reach vegetation in the higher levels to avoid competition for food with other browsers, like the zebras and the antelopes. So, this person says that the short-necked giraffes were the ancestral forms or parental forms. These short-necked giraffes, which were the ancestral forms or parental forms, began stretching their necks to actually reach the vegetation in the higher levels of the trees or plants. And at the end of the day, they were actually avoiding competition from other browsers in that environment. So at the end of the day, the longer neck that developed in these ancestral forms of the giraffes became successively transmitted or passed on to the next generation. So the next generation, now the offspring and the generations to actually get talked about here, had an advantage over the short-necked ancestral forms. Eventually, the long-necked species, the present-day giraffe now, was able to get formed. Obviously, the short-necked giraffes lacked food because of the long-necked giraffes being able to have an access to the vegetation in the higher plants, making them to actually die or actually migrate. They became extinct. Another example could be this. Lamarck's theory is the actual appearance of the flightless birds, such as the ostrich, the emu, the kiwi. You see, we are actually told that the ostrich, emu, and kiwi initially used to fly. They had normal wings for flight, but they disused their wings. They used their wings for flying in the areas that never demanded flying. At the end of the day, because they used their wings to fly in the areas that never demanded flying, then that means they disused their wings. And in the process, the wings became reduced in size. On becoming reduced in size, now the wings of the ancestral forms, that characteristic became transmitted to their offspring or subsequent generations. In the process, we have the present day flightless kiwi, emu, and ostrich. You see, people have criticized Lamarck's theory because if I am working in a construction site or I am weightlifting, I'll become more masculine. I'll develop muscles. The development of the muscles or the ability of I becoming more masculine becomes more phenotypic. It is going to actually affect my phenotype and not my genetic makeup or genotype. So the idea that whatever we actually acquire as a characteristic because of using or disusing our body structures is not actually correct. Because there's no way in which I can actually weightlift. I can actually work in a construction site, develop muscles, then those characteristics or that muscular aspect becomes transmitted to my offspring or my subsequent generations. Because I would have actually affected my phenotype, my outward appearance, and not my genotype or genetic makeup. So, it is the explanation that acquired characteristics are inherited that makes this theory very unacceptable. It becomes unacceptable to actually tell us that the acquired features or characteristics, mainly affecting the phenotype or the outward appearance, can become transmitted to the subsequent generations because none of our phenotype can get to that point of getting related to what we call the inheritance of characteristics. What we transmit to our offspring or to our subsequent generations is found in the genotype, in our genetic makeup, in our DNA, and not what you can see from outside in terms of our phenotype or overall characteristics. So, phenotypically acquired characteristics which do not affect the genotype of an organism or an individual cannot be inherited. Phenotypically acquired characteristics which do not affect the genotype of an individual cannot be inherited. So that's all about Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck's theory that actually came into use in 1809. Let's turn to something else, and we're going to look at Darwin's theory of natural selection. I told you that Charles Darwin came up with his theory in 1859. He actually wrote a book called The Origin of Species. You see, another one called The Descent of Man during evolution. So his books, The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, have actually captured very crucial information concerning evolution. So Darwin proposed an explanation for the mechanism of evolution in contrast to Lamarck's theory. And Darwin put forward his explanation based on a concept called natural selection. That is to tell you that there was a way in which a particular feature you had could make you to get selected against by the environment or selected for by the environment. If that feature could make you to get adapted to the environment, you could get selected for. If whatever you had as a feature could not make you to get selected for, you could now get selected against, and you could not survive in that environment. You could either migrate, die, or get actually extinct. So some of the hypotheses that this guy put in place, or features he actually placed in place in terms of his theory on what we call natural selection, from his book The Origin of Species 1859, proposed that one, variations occur within members of a population. Variations occur within members of a population. Variations occur within members of a population. I repeat, variations occur within members of a population. You see, you can have normal parents, for example, but these parents are normal in terms of height. They're all tall. But a dwarf individual just arises from this population. So a variation, a difference, maybe between the offspring and the parents, can arise within a particular population of related individuals. And these variations arise by chance and from within the individual. You see, I cannot actually understand as to why, for example, biologically, if all parents are phenotypically tall, then you expect 90% to a greater extent to have an offspring which is also phenotypically taller, because this offspring is going to acquire the genetic information in terms of height from the parents. So if they are all tall, we expect the offspring to also be tall. But if we find a population of individuals who are tall and accidentally we end up having a dwarf individual arising from this population, that's a variation that has actually arisen from this population by chance. Now, the second proposition to capture this. This person says that through sexual reproduction, these characteristics are transmitted to the successive offspring. I have a population of tall individuals. Then accidentally, by chance, variation occurs. where an offspring which is dwarf arises. This characteristic of dwarfism in this individual will get transmitted to the next generation or offspring. That dwarfism can either become advantageous to the individual or disadvantageous to the individual. Something else to note. He says that, just the wind, the number of offspring will always outweigh the parental generation. We can have many offspring. For example, you can have two parents, see, giving birth to 10 children. Look at that. So the number of offspring will outweigh the number of the parents, or the number of offspring will outweigh the parental generation. But only a few of these offspring will survive to adulthood, and they can also be able to end up reproducing as well. Now, why do we end up having few parents or a smaller parental generation giving rise to a larger number of offspring, such that the number of offspring outweigh the number of the parental generation? It's because the environment has pressures. Some of these pressures are like predation, we have diseases, we have competition for food, and as well breeding sites. Even organisms compete for breeding sites. So if we have predators, a predator is an animal that can actually kill and feed on another organism. So if you have predators, the predators will actually feed on this offspring, reducing their numbers. If you have diseases, the diseases can attack this offspring and kill some of them that may not survive. If there's competition, there might be a competition between the offspring or between the offspring and their parental generation. Some of these offspring may not survive to adulthood. They'll actually end up getting killed. There will be competition for breeding sites. At the end of the day, some of the offspring will end up dying. So at the end of the day, even if the offspring number is greater than that of the parental generation, only few of these offspring can actually mature to adulthood because of the pressures from the environment. So at the end of the day, members of the same species are in constant competition for them to survive. They have actually to end up competing adequately so that they can end up surviving. So they're actually looking for an effort to survive. And this concept is referred to as struggle for existence. The resources are limited, the offspring are many in number, so they are competing to survive. They have to actually struggle and have an effort to survive. So they have what you call struggle for existence because of the limited resources in their environment. So in the struggle for the existence, those offspring with advantageous characteristics will become well adapted to the environment because they'll be well suited to the environment. So if this has a long neck, for example, as a giraffe, and this has a short neck as a giraffe, the long-necked giraffe has an advantage over the short-necked giraffe. It will survive. So as they'll be struggling for existence, the long-necked giraffe becomes advantageous, becomes advantaged, you see, and then the short-necked giraffe becomes disadvantaged. So at the end of the day, the long-necked giraffe is selected for to survive in the environment. The short-necked giraffe is selected against by that environment. So it does not well get suited to the environment, but the long-necked giraffe becomes well suited to the environment. So the long-necked giraffe will get selected, survive, and reproduce. Those that are poorly adapted, like the short-necked giraffe, will actually end up perishing, and they won't transmit their characteristics to the next generation. Look at that. So long-necked giraffes will survive. They will actually become well adapted to the environment. They'll be able to actually struggle and exist. They'll have an effort to struggle and exist. They'll survive. At the end of the day, what happens? They'll be able to reproduce and give rise to new offspring with those new characteristics. So that aspect of this long-necked giraffe surviving is actually refers to as survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. So the most fittest organism is the long-necked giraffe. The short-necked giraffe does not survive. So there's what you call survival of the fittest in this case. So which one survives? The long-necked giraffe. So struggle for existence and survival of the fittest are sometimes misunderstood But what does this actually mean to us? Environmental pressures can be on the population. We have competition, we have diseases, we have predation, competition for breeding size, competition for resources. All these are environmental pressures. They can have a greater impact on the population. And only those members with advantageous variation will survive, and this will make them to survive. For example, a colored individual does not struggle to exist the predators. Why? Its color can well camouflage. It thus escapes predation. According to this person called Darwin, natural selection means just a chance or a probability or a chance of occurrence. So it's just by chance that a certain individual or species is suited to a particular environment, and while the other species or individual is not well suited to the environment. So the one that becomes well suited can escape the environmental pressures. It will survive, and after all, it will end up transmitting its characteristics to the next generation. The one that does not well get suited will actually end up migrating, dying, or becoming extinct. It won't survive. So it ends up dying. Natural selection is a mechanism with beneficial variations. Look at that. So natural selection, the nature selects the most suited organism, and that most suited organism can actually be able to end up surviving, so that that characteristic can get transmitted. So the characteristics which are actually more advantageous, the characters that can make the organism to become well suited, can actually get perpetuated to the next generation. The disadvantageous variations, on the other hand, will get eliminated. So those individuals with beneficial characteristics or beneficial variations are better well adapted to compete for resources within their environment. So they will survive, reproduce, and transmit these variations to their next generation. Those with disadvantageous variations are less well adapted. Hence, they are not able to compete favorably. Why? They don't have the appropriate features or qualities to actually make them survive. So at the end of the day, they become eliminated. Now, remember, it's all about few generations or smaller features or characteristics getting transmitted to the next generation. The accumulation of these smaller variations or differences or characteristics getting transmitted to the next generation will end up resulting into the emergence of new species. Imagine I had a short neck, I developed a long neck, I transmitted that to the next generation. That next generation developed a particular feature also, then transmitted that extra feature to the next generation it had. That other generation developed a feature as well. So the resultant generations are actually accumulating few generations characteristics. Those new generations, those resultant generations, those subsequent generations will be accumulating few characteristics, smaller features, smaller variations. And at the end of the day, the next generations won't be the same as the ancestral forms. So that's what you're saying, there will be emergence of new species. Now, you see, sometimes the changes you are talking about here, like I had a short neck, I developed a long neck. I transmitted that to the next generation. It has been traced back to what we call a mutation. It is believed that mutations occur randomly within our genetic makeup. So organisms that carry beneficial mutations can be able to pass them to their next generation through reproduction. So sexual reproduction is particularly significant since it can actually allow the transmission of characteristics to the next generation. Remember, meiosis leads to the formation of gametes, like the male gametes and the female gametes. So meiosis is a process, a type of cell division that occurs in the testes of the male and in the ovary of the female. Through oogenesis, the formation of the eggs, and spermatogenesis, the formation of the sperm cells. we can form gametes, the male gametes and the female gametes. When the male and the female recombine through what we call fertilization, they're actually bringing together different variations or characteristics into this new generation or offspring. So these mutations are going to be transmitted to many generations. And at the end of the day, we shall have an emergence of new species in the subsequent generations, different from the parental forms. And you see, sometimes the emergence of these new species requires a very longer period of time. It's not something that can actually take a single day or even a week. So the emergence of these new generations, these new species or offspring will require a longer period of time because the rate of mutations that a particular species undergoes requires a very long period of time. Now, experiments have actually confirmed that mutations can either be harmful or beneficial. Whether harmful or beneficial, they will result in the change of the structure of the offspring. See, where the organs and appendages and the structures of these organisms can end up becoming changed because of the transmitted mutations through what you call recombination of the male and female gametes, through what you call fertilization. Through what you call fertilization. So I think that's all about Charles Darwin's theory in as far as these concepts are concerned. That's all about Charles Darwin's theorem in as far as this information is concerned. Now, you'd want to have a practical explanation of evolution. You'll be told that in the 18th century, before Britain underwent industrialization, the lichens as plants in that country were actually able to have a better camouflaging property of the white speckled peppered moth. Look at that. In the 18th century, before industrialization in Britain, the tree trunks of the lichens could well camouflage, could well be able to actually protect, could well be able to actually make the white speckled peppered moth to actually not get eaten by the predators, like the bats. So the dark melanic peppered moth were well seen by the predators. They became eaten. At the end of the day, they could not be able to transmit their characters to the next generations. So the surviving white speckled peppered moth on the tree trunks of these lichens could now be able to actually reproduce and transmit their white speckled characteristic to their next generations. So at the end of the day, we had an emergence of the white speckled peppered moth. You see, so the white speckled peppered moth before industrialization was selected for by the environment. Then the dark melanic peppered moth was selected against. So they became extinct, or they actually died out. After industrialization, the smoke or the soot from the industries covered the tree trunks of lichens. The dark melanic form of this peppered moth became well camouflaged. The white speckled peppered moth could not be able to get camouflaged. They were eaten by the predators. So the white speckled peppered moth, after industrialization and the covering of smoke and soot uh, on the tree trunks of lichens, became against or became selected against, and then the dark melanic forms were selected for by the environment. They survived. They were perpetuated. They actually ended up transmitting their characteristics to the next generations. They survived. So it tells us that the dark forms were better protected in the industrial area against predation from birds than the lighter forms. In the smoke and soot pollution areas, there was a greater frequency of the melanic form, while in the soot-free areas, the speckled white moths predominated or were greater in numbers. Thus, the agent of natural selection was selective predation on the unprotected forms. Natural selection tells us that the organisms can either get selected against or selected for. In this country called Britain, when industrialization had actually taken toll on this country, the smoke and the soot polluted the air or the environment. It covered the tree trunks of lichens. In those areas, the dark or the melanic forms were well protected. They never got eaten. At the end of the day, they became selected for. They survived. They predominated in those areas. In the areas where there was no industrialization, the lichens were never covered by smoke and soot. The white speckled forms were well protected. They predominated. They increased in numbers. They were larger in numbers. The dark melanic forms were actually predated and they actually never got selected for. They became selected against. And you see, the occurrence of the melanic form could have been due to a mutation. You see, because the white speckled peppered moth might have undergone some changes or mutation in the genetic makeup of these organisms, in the DNA of these organisms. That change or that variation or that mutation might end up getting transmitted to subsequent generations. You see, to form what we call the dark melanic form. Now, you see, this is just a possible transition towards what we call speciation. And that means that there are varieties representing what you call the same species. The dark melanic form and the white speckled form are the varieties representing this peppered moth. These forms are called polymorphic forms. Polymorphic forms. Polymorphic forms. The polymorphic forms are just the forms that a particular species can exist. The variety that can actually form a backbone of these organisms. For example, the peppered moth can either be white speckled or dark melanic. For example, if you look at what we call the sickle cell trait, that has maybe one of the chains of the hemoglobin, one of the chains of the polypeptide hemoglobin, having glutamic acid getting replaced by valine, can also be a good example of what we call natural selection in action. Now, it's known that there's a high frequency of this mutant gene in places where malaria incidence is high. Those people with sickle cell trait can better survive malarial attacks. You see, so if you have a mutant gene or a mutant gene responsible for sickle cell trait, you can better survive malaria. So in areas that have a higher incidence of malaria, you'll find a greater number of people with the sickle cell trait. Why? Because they can survive the malaria. Look at that incidence or scenario. So areas with high cases or greater outbreak of malaria can better have a greater number of sickle cell trait individuals because they can survive the attacks. And of course, in those areas, you'll have organisms with normal hemoglobin getting selected against because they'll actually get eliminated by malarial attacks. You see, so individuals with sickle cell traits in areas prone or with areas with a greater outbreak of malaria will get selected for. Those with normal hemoglobin will get selected against. That's what we call natural selection in action. And at the end of the day, those who are heterozygous, that is to actually give you this concept, HbA, HbS. Of course, Hb stands for hemoglobin. So this is a carrier of sickle cell anemia. So he has what we call a sickle cell trait condition. He is heterozygous. That means the alleles are not actually similar. HbA, HbS. That individual can better survive malaria. See, so heterozygous individuals with a sickle cell trait can better survive malarial attacks than their individual counterparts. So heterozygous individuals are selected for, while normal individuals with the normal hemoglobin are actually going to be selected against. And of course, in this case, you're going to realize that drugs, antibiotics, and pesticides are chemical substances that you can be able to use to kill disease-causing microorganisms like bacteria, some pests, either field pests or storage pests, and some other chemicals that can actually get used to prey on crops and maybe animals to kill the pests. You see, sometimes these antibiotics and pesticides are rarely 100% effective for your information. Why? Because some pathogens and pests usually survive and reproduce. They actually overcome the effect of these chemicals. So on surviving, although some get killed, but some can survive. So you see, I'm trying to spray a particular area with chemicals or pests or using antibiotics to kill bacterial infections. Then some bacteria die while others survive the chemicals, or some pests die while others survive the chemicals. What happens? Those that survive reproduce. When they reproduce, they are transmitting that changed genetic information or that mutated aspect of their DNA to their next generation. So using antibiotics and pesticides repeatedly, or when these organisms or when these microorganisms get exposed to these pesticides and antibiotics repetitively, they actually undergo what we call mutation. So within the population, some individuals possess the gene for resistance or acquire it through mutation. Hence, they can actually survive. So as I'm spraying these chemicals like pesticides to kill these microorganisms, or so I'm using these antibiotics to kill these bacteria, some bacteria and some pests contain a gene for resistance against the chemicals getting used or drugs getting used. Or some may have acquired that gene through mutation. On acquiring that gene, that makes them to survive the attack by the chemicals. Those that survive can transmit these characteristics to their offspring. So at the end of the day, we shall establish a new generation of bacteria and pests which are now resistant to the chemicals and antibiotics. So if a mutation occurs in a population of bacteria, the mutant bacteria will produce an enzyme that will break down the penicillin as an antibiotic. So continued use of penicillin fails to cure the disease or the bacterial infection. Let me repeat this. I actually end up having a group of bacteria causing some bacterial infections. I used penicillin made by Penicillium as a very good example of a fungi to cure this bacterial infection. And then some bacteria mutate. They become mutant. They might have acquired this gene for resistance against the bacterial, the antibiotics through sexual reproduction. Or some just develop that change when these chemicals are used for a longer period of time. They become mutant, they produce an enzyme, the enzyme breaks down the penicillin or the drug. Some insects or some pests also acquire a gene for resistance, or they actually become mutated, they become mutants because of the prolonged use of the chemicals. They also produce an enzyme that works against the chemicals getting used against them to kill them. So if you look at insects like mosquitoes, they possess a gene which makes them to synthesize an enzyme. So that gene, they might have acquired it from their ancestral forms, or they might have actually developed it through what you call a mutation if the chemicals are used over them for a longer period of time. So they can work against DDT as an important pesticide to kill them. So you see, you are trying to look at mosquitoes as insects. They are going to cause malaria, more specifically, the Anopheles mosquito, the female Anopheles mosquito. More specifically, having a plasmodium that carries that infectious part as a toxoid into the body of a human being. I've actually used DDT as a very important insecticide to kill these mosquitoes. Some have a resisting or resistant gene. Some develop that gene to resist against the chemicals. That gene can actually help them to synthesize an enzyme. That enzyme can break down the DDT. This makes the DDT to become ineffective in the control of such insects. The control of Plasmodium has been made difficult due to the ability of the Plasmodium to rapidly change its coat surface antigens. So sometimes you are actually using DDT as a very important insecticide to kill the mosquito, the Plasmodium, to be more specific. The Plasmodium, in the process of actually having the chemical getting used over it for a longer period of time, ends up developing a resistant coating on its antigens. So this makes the plasmodia resist the drug meant to kill it. So it's also very difficult for us to make a vaccine against Plasmodium, the one that causes malaria. So sometimes some strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that causes TB have actually been able to become resistant as well, because of either developing a gene when several antibiotics are actually used against it, or acquiring that resistant gene from the ancestral forms. It's very difficult for us to treat and cure or eradicate TB in the population because the mutant bacteria will live long enough to reproduce and multiply. So human attempts to eradicate various species of disease-causing microorganisms or different species of pests have resulted in evolution. I take a particular antibiotic to kill any bacterial infection causing tuberculosis or any infection that demands the use of penicillin. In the process, when I overuse or use these antibiotics for a longer period of time over these microorganisms, the bacteria in each case become mutants. They either develop a gene to become resistant or they acquire the gene for resistance from their parental forms. In the process, because of that mutation, they develop a coating on their antigens. So, no antibiotics can work against them. They become selected for. Those with no gene that can make them to become mutant or resistant will get killed by it. Those that do not actually end up having the normal DNA structure or have what you call a mutant gene will actually be able to resist the antibiotics that get you to actually treat these infections. So this evolution has been brought about probably through the natural selection of the pathogens and pests resistant to whichever agent is actually employed in the control of these infectious diseases. Thank you so much, and that's the end of our topic.